Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our latest Department of Defense Information Analysis Center webinar covering USAID's Conflict Assessment Framework. My name is Steve Rutherford, and I'm the Director of the HDIAC, and today we have the privilege of hosting Mr. David Hunsaker for this presentation. I want to start off by thanking all of you and saying that I'm grateful to everyone who's taking time out to join us during these times. I'd like to thank our sponsor as well, the Defense Technical Information Center. The DTIC-IAC mission is to collect, synthesize, produce, and disseminate scientific and technical information to DoD and federal government users. If you've not checked out their website at www.discover.dtic.mil, take a moment to review their expansive services. Without their sponsorship, this webinar series just wouldn't be possible. So I'd like to go over a few admin notes as we start out today. Please note that all the attendee lines have been muted. If you have questions during the webinar, we're going to ask that you submit them using the attendee chat box that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. And we'll work to save the last 10 minutes or so of the presentation to go over those questions and discuss them. Please note that this webinar is also being recorded, and we're going to provide a link for this recording and the slides at the end of this presentation so you can download them later. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Mr. David Hunsaker from the U.S. Agency for International Development. David is a Senior Conflict and Peacebuilding Advisor in USAID's Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention. Mr. Hunsaker specializes in issues of religion, identity, and conflict, as well as development responses to violent extremism and insurgency. For most of the last 12 years, one of Dave's central roles has been technical oversight of a congressionally mandated program to bring together Israelis and Palestinians around issues of common interest. Dave has also provided support on conflict mitigation, religious freedom, and countering violent extremism to myriad USAID missions, including an assignment as the development advisor in the International Security Assistance Forces Force Regeneration Cell in support of the implementation of Afghanistan's peace and reintegration program. Most recently, he served as the Religion, State, and Society Specialist in USAID's Central Asian Regional Mission. In this capacity, he was responsible for advising USAID and U.S. embassies in the 5 Central Asian republics on integrating religious communities into U.S. government-funded development programming in order to counter the spread of extremism in the region and to promote inclusive development. He also worked in the U.S. Embassy in Uzbekistan, where he provided support to local human rights groups and facilitated embassy outreach to religious leaders. Dave has a BA in Islamic Studies from the University of Michigan and an MA in Near Eastern Languages and Civilization from the University of Washington. He's a fluent Uzbek speaker and is conversant in both Turkish and other Turkic languages. With that, it's our distinct honor to host him today, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dave.
Thanks so much, Steve, for that introduction, and it's really my pleasure to be here today. I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about our conflict assessment framework and hopefully entertaining a few questions at the end. So the conflict assessment framework that I'm going to cover here is one of various assessment frameworks that USAID uses to kind of analyze the situation on the ground in the countries in which we work in preparation for doing our programming. Various sectors have their own frameworks that they use in order to do assessments, and sometimes we'll bring them together as hybrid assessments when one or more issues may be related to one another. So oftentimes we'll combine with a democracy and governance assessment, for example, or something around the environment. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm just going to focus on what our office does to analyze conflict. First, a little bit about the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention. We are part of a new bureau at USAID, the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. We had a predecessor office and a predecessor bureau that had been in existence for close to 2 decades. But just this July, we finalized a transformation process for our bureau, which split off from what had been the Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau. We split off the humanitarian assistance pieces into a Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and we became part of this Conflict Prevention and Stabilization Bureau, alongside the Office of Transition Initiatives and the Office of Civil Military Cooperation, offices that some in the audience may also have familiarity with. We're a relatively small bureau and a very relatively small center. But our focus is really about using development tools to be able to help our USAID missions to engage in conflict mitigation and peace building in order to get out ahead of potential conflicts that would otherwise disrupt our development programs and the development trajectories in the programs in which we work. As I mentioned, we're a relatively small bureau with 3 basic divisions. We have our Programs and Operational Support Division, which handles a lot of things like budgeting and admin and those sorts of things. The Field Partnerships Division, which looks at different regional areas and focuses on countries in those regions, as well as some cross-cutting themes like transnational organized crime or violence prevention as they pertain to our work in the field. And then we have a Leadership and Learning Division, which is really responsible for the kind of broader high-level analysis that's not confined to one particular country, but looks at trends overall in the violence and conflict prevention space. As I said, we're relatively small. When I joined the predecessor office of conflict management and mitigation about 12 years ago, we were only 12 individuals. And we're thankfully, as part of this transformation, up to 30 people now, with a growth trajectory that we're hoping will reach about 60 total. So we like to think that we punch above our weight for a relatively small office. And one of the ways in which we do that is by doing country level analysis. And our main tool for doing that is the Conflict Assessment Framework, which I'm going to talk to you about today. So a conflict assessment consists of 2 basic stages: a diagnosis phase, and then looking at the outcomes of that diagnosis and figuring out what it is that USAID as a development actor can do in response to the conflict dynamics that are identified. In this discussion today, I'm going to focus primarily on the diagnosis, but also touch a little bit on the response. As I said earlier, our conflict assessment is to apply the tools that we have for foreign assistance. So we need to have an understanding of the international environment in which we're working. We generally will conduct a conflict assessment on a specific country or a sub-region of that country in order to analyze what it is that we should be doing in order to make sure that our assistance first is doing no harm and is conflict sensitive, not exacerbating any of the conflict dynamics that may be present in the country. So from that perspective, it's an important preventative tool. But we also look to see where conflict dynamics are perhaps already manifesting in violence and conflict, or we fear that they could be leading to that we can look at interventions that we can do a little bit more proactively. We start with a desk study, looking at the literature that is available on conflict dynamics. We will review that literature and on the basis of it, try to surface some specific questions that may be relevant to our field work. On the basis of that, we'll develop a field implementation plan that will include things like how many translators do we need? How many teams? Where will the team be going? Are there specific places that we want to perhaps focus on? Are there some academics that we should be interviewing ahead of time through some pre-interviews to maybe build upon some of the information that was in the desk study? We will then assemble the team usually in the capital of the country in which we're going to deploy, and we'll have a team orientation, because we'll oftentimes have a mix of people participating in a conflict assessment that are coming from a variety of different areas around and go back home. We want to have a holistic approach so that there is a shared understanding of the conflict dynamics, and so that when the Washington consultants, whether they be USG direct hire consultants or some consultants that we've perhaps hired just for the purposes of the assessment, we'll be able to make sure that there is a shared understanding that's resident at the USAID mission in the country and at the USAID embassy in the country. So those will oftentimes be the first folks that we're also talking to. We'll talk to different technical teams at the USAID mission, as well as the political section, the defense attaché, others, to get their understanding of what's happening on the ground. But then from there, we will have built a fieldwork plan that will then go into motion, where the teams will fan out generally for about 10 to 15 days to do a series of group interviews and key informant interviews that will gather data that we will then analyze through our assessment framework that I'll get into in just a moment. So there'll be a very intensive period of about 10 to 15 days where we're just having interview after interview after interview with a general line of inquiry that we'll use to gather information. Once we complete that intensive interview fieldwork phase, we'll come back and we'll try to pull together what we've heard in a synthesis process. And the main filter that we use to do that is our conflict assessment framework. We have some tools that we use to help us kind of funnel the information through the conflict assessment framework, or the CAF as we call it in short. And you may hear me refer to it as the CAF several times through the presentation. We use some tools to organize the data, but at the end of the day, the organizing framework is our CAF framework. And you'll hear a lot more about that in just a moment. And at the end, our final product is a report that will be shared either internally within the country team at the embassy and at the USAID mission. And sometimes we will share that also with host governments and civil society actors, and sometimes back with the individuals that we have interviewed as well. And that will include both the findings of the field work, but it'll also include recommendations of things that can be done. That's incredibly important for USAID as a development agency, that we are not just analyzing for the sake of analysis. While that's important and that helps to inform things, we think it's really important to connect that with the actions that we recommend would be taken immediately following that. So as we think about the kinds of data that we're going to gather through a conflict assessment, we like to think about it in shorthand as the facts, the feelings, and the forecasts. The facts are relatively straightforward. They're the things that can be empirically proven, things that are can be known through research, and that won't necessarily have there won't be a diverse set of opinions about whether or not they are true or not. They can be generally empirically proven. And we'll gather that information through our literature review, the death study that I mentioned. But we'll also, gather some of that information in the course of our field work as well through the interviews. But the real focus of the interviews is to look at the feelings, or what could otherwise be called the perceptions. The conflict assessment framework really is focused on gauging what are people's perceptions of the things that are going on around them and how they interact with them. And on the basis of that, do they have predictions or forecasts, our third F, of things that they think may happen as a result of people's perceptions of their situation. So, as I said, we gather information around these three kind of main buckets of facts, feelings, and forecasts, and then we will use what we gather to do our analysis. The diagnosis, which is another way basically of saying the analysis of the data that's gathered. We recognize that because we're talking about 10 to 15 days of in-country work that is complemented by a desk study that was prepared in a specific moment in time, that we're talking about conflict dynamics that are manifesting at that particular moment, or within a generally circumscribed period of time. We can't make overly general statements, so it's by necessity what we think of as a snapshot. In November 2020 in country X, this is what we're seeing. On the basis of that, we can make certain informed judgments about where we think that's going to go. That's the trajectories part of it. So we are taking our snapshot and looking based on our informed analysis, thinking about how that might play out into the future, turning that snapshot into a movie, thinking about, okay, if there is tension in a particular part of the country, and then there is something that happens, whether it be a low-level clash between ethnic groups, or a natural disaster, or elections in a particular geographic region around autonomy, what could the possible consequences of that be? We kind of play that out in terms of thinking about what the trajectories might be. But we're thinking about our conflict dynamics. We're most concerned about the interplay between grievances that groups may have and the ability of individuals or in groups to be able to mobilize their constituents around those grievances. That's what we call a conflict driver. The flip side of that are mitigating factors, because key actors can also mobilize things within society to prevent them from becoming violent conflict. And we think of those as, key actors mobilizing a resilience that may be resident in society. And resiliencies can take a variety of different forms. They can be things that are normatively good, like a strong peace movement that's well respected within the country, or they can be things that are normatively not so good, like a very oppressive security apparatus, for example. That may mitigate conflict, but it may just be keeping a lid on it rather than actually serving to, maintain peace in a positive way. So what we're interested in analyzing is how these grievances and resiliencies interact with the key groups in a society to mobilize them either towards violence and conflict or towards peace. All of this, of course, happens within a context. And so we start by looking at that context, but oftentimes those are things which honestly are not within USAID's manageable interest to be able to change, but that are important things that we need to know as we understand the conflict dynamics that are happening in that place. We need to understand the history. We need to understand the physical and geographic characteristics. Is it a mountainous country? Are populations cut off as a result of that? Is it an archipelago where certain islands are more or less connected to the center? And what are the implications of that? Are there things like growth in youth populations, or is one ethnic group growing faster than others? Are there certain things that are either promoting economic growth or keeping it back? Are there malign or positive external influences from other countries, whether they be neighbors or far away? All of these things are things that we take into consideration because they will impact upon the conflict dynamics, even if they are not in and of themselves things that we can take an action about. The conflict dynamics themselves, as I described them before, are the grievances and resiliences that emerge and then interact with identities that are held by members of the population. We're interested in how those identities interact with institutional performance, those things in society, oftentimes, but not limited to state institutions, and how those two things interact. Those interactions form what we call social patterns. And those social patterns can reinforce grievances or can reinforce resiliencies that are then mobilized by key actors or key mobilizers. To break that down further, when we look at the interaction between institutions and identity, we're interested basically in two different things. The legitimacy of the institutions in the eyes of the groups in society, as well as the effectiveness of those institutions. So there may be multiple layers of identity in society. Identities form in multiple different ways, and we all have multiple different identities. One of my identities, for example, is as a US citizen. Another identity I have is as a father. Another identity is, comes from my ethnic or racial background. These are all things that we each hold, and some of them are things that we don't define for ourselves. We're born into them. Others are identities that we may form ourselves through our upbringing, our education, and our social mobility, for example. So how do those identities then interact with the institutions that are present in society? Again, oftentimes government institutions. Are my interactions with those institutions defined by my identity? Does my ethnicity impact how I get certain services from the government? Does my identity, perhaps influence how I feel about an institution's fairness or its ability to provide just services or provide justice to my group? So identities are not just about the individual, but they're how collectively identities are mobilized as groups vis-a-vis the institutions of society. So when we're talking about legitimacy, we're really talking about people's perceptions. Do they perceive, as a particular ethnic group, for example, that those institutions are perhaps threatening their beliefs, their values, their dignity? Do they feel looked down upon? Or do they feel that because of their identity, that their values and dignity is reflected in those institutions of state? On the other side of it, with effectiveness, we're talking about things that are things that can be more empirically established of whether or not institutions are delivering the things that they should be delivering. Are they able to provide, for example, security equally across the board? Are they able to provide livelihoods and reinforce aspirations that citizens may have in a particular country? And so effectiveness issues may impact society very broadly, or because, like I said, geographic differences and inability to access certain populations, that sort of thing, is effectiveness different depending on where you sit? And does that overlap with a particular identity group or groups? These interactions are what we call the social patterns. And so those social patterns are then formed in ways that are viewed as negative, what we would call the grievances that I mentioned before, or in positive ways that we would view as resiliencies and mitigating factors in society against conflict. In terms of what are some examples of the most common social patterns of grievance that threaten identities and that produce outcomes that are considered ineffective, illegitimate, or both, are these five. These are the five most common social patterns of grievance. It's not an exhaustive list, but the research that our office has done has identified these as really the most common. The first is elitism. It's really the vertical inequalities that may exist in society, where you have populations who are viewed as the haves and those who are viewed as the have-nots, where you may have a royal family, for example, who has access to a disproportionate amount of wealth, where the vast majority of the population, because they're not born into that family, don't have access to it. That's an example of elitism. Exclusion operates similarly, but it is on a horizontal basis, where you may have populations in the country where one has greater access than one or more others. So that's often different ethnic groups or different linguistic or religious groups in a society that are, citizens of the same country, but speak different languages, have distinct identities, and there is a view that maybe one has greater control or access to resources in society than the other. That's exclusion. Chronic capacity deficits are more about the more on the effectiveness side of things, and are really about the ability of the government to deliver the things that a population would typically expect to be able to receive from their government. And some governments simply aren't able to provide, basic needs, whether that be education or health services or justice and security. And it manifests itself. It tends to manifest itself in very focused ways, in particular geographies, or it may be a countrywide issue, or it may divide differently between urban and rural, for example. But it's really about the ability of governments to provide. The fourth are transitional moments or unmet expectations. And the best way to kind of describe that might be if a country has a revolution where they have overturned a highly authoritarian leader or regime. And the expectation is, well, now we have freedom and we're going to see changes, and we're going to have more opportunities to have a voice in government, and maybe there's going to be economic development that results. But not all transitions turn out the way that people expect, and there may be things that prevent that from happening. So transitional moments can really be things where a lot of grievances will develop and perhaps explode over time when it becomes clear that those expectations that they had in that moment weren't really going to pan out. The fifth one, corruption, is a little bit different from the other four because we tend to see it as an overlay of the other four patterns of grievance, where the elitism manifests in many ways through the corruption, or the chronic capacity deficits. The only way that you can get access to a service is by engaging in corrupt behavior, for example. So we don't see corruption as a sole factor that generally leads to violent conflict, but it does tend to be present where these other four are also present. When we think about mitigating factors, we are thinking about the ability of a system or things within the system to be able to withstand and recover from shocks. So if there is a natural disaster, for example, does the government alongside civil society have the ability to pick up the pieces and recover from that? Do they have the ability to deal with a terrorist attack? Do they have the ability to basically keep things from becoming violent? And as I mentioned before, it's important to recognize that a resiliency is not always a normative positive. Like I said, authoritarian regimes can be incredibly resilient and incredibly effective when it comes to making sure that violent conflict does not erupt in their countries. Just think of North Korea, not a country where we see a whole lot of internal domestic violence or upheaval, because the regime has such tight control on so many elements of society. So it may be effective at mitigating conflict, but that's only because it has this ability to suppress the grievances that may be present in society. So we have to be careful when we're looking at resiliencies, and particularly as we think about the response phase later on in our analysis, that we're not doing something that is reinforcing a negative resiliency or making matters worse. So just to then take this a little bit further, okay, you can have lots of grievances in society. But not all grievances manifest in violent conflict. In fact, most of them don't. So what is the difference between an unmobilized grievance and one that leads to violent conflict? Well, it takes individuals or groups that have resources in society to be able to mobilize those grievances towards violent conflict, or to maintain peace if violence could otherwise break out. We have key mobilizers for peace as well, who mobilize the resiliencies. So we want to identify through our analysis who those individuals or groups might be and how they are interacting with those grievances. Are they using them to promote a particular agenda? Are they using that to perhaps stir up feelings of anger, which are not in proportion to what is actually happening? So we're looking at those social patterns of grievance and resilience, and looking at those key individuals and groups who have resources in society to be able to mobilize them one way or another. We then look at that snapshot that we have gathered around grievances and resiliencies and key mobilizers, and consider ways in which it could possibly play out. First, we look at trends in society. We may see, for example, growing dissatisfaction around the pace of democratic reforms or around economic growth. Are there things that are continuing over a long period of time to show worrying trends? So that's the one element of it. And those tend to play out over time, and they're a bit easier to identify because they've slowly been building, or there are things that perhaps have manifested in the past. And so there's a high likelihood that we could see them again in the future. And then there are triggers. Those are things that may be a little bit more episodic and happen in moments of time that could push the conflict dynamics in one direction or another. That could be elections, for example. A referendum around autonomy goes one direction or another. In a case where perhaps we're looking at exclusion within society between two large ethnic groups, if the smaller group had been advocating for autonomy and they weren't able to achieve it, that may be something that triggers violence. Or the opposite, maybe the larger group didn't want to give up their control. So these are things that we may or may not be able to predict, because an election or a referendum, those are things that are generally slated, weeks, months, years in advance, and so we can see them coming. But a natural disaster or a terrorist attack or a random accident that then gives life to grievances that key actors mobilize may be something that we wouldn't necessarily be able to predict in a moment of time. But if we've seen those sorts of things play out in the past, we can identify them as potential triggers in our analysis. We take all of that together, the context, the conflict dynamics, the trajectories, and we break it down, and we then develop an analytical narrative. Something that doesn't necessarily end up being in a report that has each of these things on the page as its header necessarily. When we develop our conflict assessment reports and our outbriefs, we're not going to necessarily be going, okay, these are the 12 resiliencies that we've seen in society. These are the 3 possible triggers that we've identified. No, we're going to bring that all together, and we're going to pull out the most salient, the most common themes that are in the conflict assessment as we've done it. And we're going to pull those out to be able to provide a narrative that is clear and compelling, and that provides a good picture of where the country or the region may be at that given time. That doesn't mean that we don't capture all of the specific data, but we are careful in thinking about how it's presented so that it can be understood and so that it can be acted upon. So the goal is to develop a cohesive analytical narrative that's going to inform decision making. As I said before, it's going to, we want to aim to have something that's going to be actionable. We don't just want to do analysis for analysis sake. So we're going to break it down into its constituent parts. We're going to do a synthesis process where we're pulling those pieces together again, and then thinking about, okay, how do they relate to one another, and what is it that we want to present on the basis of that. So it brings together the impressions and the insights from the data collection, and it helps the team, and then by extension, the broader country team at the embassy or the USAID mission, and more broadly, into an understanding of what the conflict dynamics are at play, and therefore it provides a common language that can be used as we move towards responding to it. And so that brings me to the response. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this particular slide, but just to give you a sense of how we take our diagnosis and then develop a series of recommendations. We're going to look at a variety of different things. We're going to take, of course, the findings from our conflict assessment. We're going to think about what are some of the best practices in the field of peace building and conflict mitigation. Are there other examples where similar things have played out and where they have been dealt with before in other contexts? One of the things that I have listed under that process box is the RPP matrix, Reflecting on Peace Practices matrix, which looks at interventions related to how do key people in society or more people in society, large groups in society, interact with their institutions, and what are some of the common ways in which interventions that either target one or the other are able to achieve success. So there's a lot of research on that that we think about as we develop our recommendations. But then we also have to think about our operational filter. Is what's happening something that we can actually have an impact on in the timing that's available to us? It may be rapidly developing on the ground in terms of the conflict, and we may not have a rapid mechanism that we can bring to bear right at that moment. But hopefully, if we've done our assessment early enough, we're able to apply it in a preventative way to get out in front of things. Do we have the financial and human resources available to us in that particular country through our aid portfolio to actually be able to impact what's happening? Do we have the partners and the partnerships, whether that be with non-governmental actors or with other governmental actors, whether that be DOD, State Department, Treasury, Department of Agriculture? Are there other donors? The UK, the Canadians, are they doing something in that space, and can we partner with them and, of course, coordinate with them in our response? And then security. does the situation allow for us to be able to even access those areas where maybe the violence is taking place, to be able to impact it in some way? And do we have a good relationship with the host government that's going to allow us to do that? All of those things go into our thinking as we're developing our recommendations so that we can put forward actionable recommendations that are within our manageable interest. And even if sometimes it's just out of reach, we still may make a recommendation that's a little bit longer term, that asks for those additional resources that might be needed, or that if we can give examples of where if we had additional resources that we may be able to do something more. We do think a little bit along those lines, but we're really focused on what is in our manageable interests financially and operationally to be able to impact upon the conflict dynamics that we've identified. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation and turn it back over to Steve or others if people have any questions that I can try to answer.
Dave, thanks so much for that presentation. I think really covered the gamut of a very methodical approach to a very complex problem. And along those lines, one of the questions we have is, so you talked about country team, you talked about the agencies that will sit around the table on country team. Clearly, some of the stuff you're getting at requires a whole of government approach, a whole of government perspective. Do you have any thoughts on the interagency in this conflict assessment framework? How does USAID see the interagency's role? Do other agencies do similar type approaches? Do you have any thoughts on that since you've served overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve, and I appreciate you asking because oftentimes we do approach this in an interagency fashion, even though we framed this discussion as USAID's conflict assessment framework. And if you go to USAID's website, you can find a copy of our framework. There is an analogous framework called the Interagency Conflict Assessment Framework that was developed around the same time with the State Department and DoD and other parts of government that is also similarly used. The main difference is really around the response element, where the interagency, the ICAF framework, the Interagency Conflict Assessment Framework, kind of bifurcates a little bit more the analysis from the response because it recognizes that there's going to be such a wide variation in an interagency assessment sometimes. So they really want they want the analysis to be interagency, but then the response may be agency specific. So those two frameworks, our framework and the ICAP framework, are very analogous in terms of the things that we look at. That being said, a USAID conflict assessment will oftentimes include other parts of the interagency that are present at post. So I've personally been on conflict assessments with individuals from UCOM, other parts of DoD, or definitely from State Department, so that we can get that shared understanding of the conflict dynamics and contribute together to those recommendations at the end. So while USAID may, in those circumstances, have the contracting mechanism where we bring some of the short-term consultants on board to help us handle the logistics of translators and transportation and all of that sort of thing, it's done with a team that is interagency in nature. So we own the final product, but it's a final product that is informed by consensus across the interagency. So it's very common for us to do that.
Excellent. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about is assessing the conflict. How about in cases of open conflict? You have experience in Afghanistan, clearly, lots of experience of the interagency approach, both pluses and minuses over the last decade and a half. How about after a conflict breaks out? How about after DoD is involved, states involved. How does this play a role?
So this methodology does apply in all stages of conflict. It can be used preventatively, as I kind of emphasized through my presentation, but it can be equally applied in situations where conflict is ongoing, and in post-conflict situations as well. The difference is really usually around access. So we may sometimes need to get creative in terms of thinking about, okay, well, how are we going to be able to, get the data in the manner that we typically would in an area where conflict is raging and we really can't get there to ask our questions directly. And frankly, it's something that we're also thinking about and grappling with in the current situation under COVID, where we're not able to get to the field with the same ease that we did previously. So it is, as a framework, applicable as a way to understand conflict dynamics at all stages of the conflict, like I said. And we have done desktop kind of scenario building situations where we've brought folks together who are informed on these issues and basically, used their expertise by proxy for what's happening in country if we can't get there, to be able to arrive at ways forward in terms of our programming. So that's one way that we've done it. There may be times when we have to go with an entirely consultant-based team where there may be no U.S. government personnel who are able to take part in the assessment because of the security constraints. So the framework, like I said, is applicable across the board. We just may need to adapt our methods of data collection to inform the framework.
Great. Thank you very much for that. It sure is good to have someone with your experience fielding these. And we have another one from a gentleman, Gene Vogt. He wants to ask about the other programs, for example, UN University for Peace. Are they helpful to the United States and as well as other countries' leaderships and the ability to coordinate with U.S. aid?
So I'm not sure that I'm familiar with the specific element that's being referred to, but certainly, we work with other international donor agencies and actors on a variety of conflict issues, including in our analysis. I mean, we have done joint conflict assessments. I know with the Department for International Development, DFID, in the UK, in certain contexts where it's made sense for us in order to best coordinate our efforts on the ground to be able to do our assessments together. I do not know of any joint assessment that we may have done with a UN entity. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I am not familiar with that. But certainly any time that you can bring additional resources to bear on a problem, that's usually helpful. But sometimes our bureaucracies can get in the way of one another, and so it has to be taken, I think, on a case-by-case basis.
Excellent, thanks. So Andrew Gonzalez asked if you can briefly expand on using your personal experiences employing the conflict assessment framework, and he asked particularly with inside Indo-PACOM, and this, the example he gives is perhaps a natural disaster that would affect Philippines, Vietnam. But I think that your personal experience of the conflict assessment framework where it's worked particularly well or lessons learned would also be valuable.
Yeah, I mean, some of the ways in which, applied my personal background. I mean, as Steve said in my biography, my background is in Islamic studies and Near Eastern languages and civilizations, and I speak certain languages, and it's always helpful if you are to take regional and or linguistic expertise and have that be an additional tool that's available to you as you do analysis and assessment. So, if I'm able to not have to work through a translator or an interpreter while I'm doing an assessment, that's going to increase, my understanding, tenfold, if not more, of what's being said and what's being implied and those sorts of things. You do definitely lose things in translation. If I have, a deep understanding of a country before I do an assessment there, that's going to help me immensely. And that's the way our office will organize itself, is generally, like I said at the very beginning, geographically. And so we're going to have our geographic experts, they're going to be doing or leading the assessments in their region in most cases. Sometimes for mentoring and other things, as we bring new people on board, people may work outside of their typical region, but having that ongoing relationship and expertise on a region just helps significantly to inform our understanding of the conflict dynamics that may be at play. So that's how I would answer that.
Excellent. So I think that's all we have time for today. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and in particular, Dave, thank you so much for that brief. Again, it's always valuable to have someone with your experience and your depth and breadth of knowledge present that, what is clearly a critical function in today's globalized world. For everyone, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the slide and recording of Dave's presentation is going to be made available for download at the HDIAC website. And you can find that at www.hdIAC.org. If you're interested in learning more about the IACs, or perhaps getting involved as a subject matter expert or presenter like you heard today, or expanding your presence in the user community, please feel free to reach out directly. You're going to see some contact information come up on the left-hand side of the screen. Just take a look at that, and please check us out. Because in addition to these monthly webinars, we typically do 2, maybe even 3 a month. We also offer monthly podcasts, so there's 2 of those that come out each month. We have bi-weekly email digest that we send out that contains the latest news in our technical focus areas. And we also provide a free technical inquiry service that offers 4 free hours of technical consulting. And then we're happy to, and we really like to perform longer duration customer-funded projects in any of our technical areas, and we can lean on our subject matter expert to help with that as well via our pre-competed contract vehicle. So again, our contact information is on the left-hand side of your screen. And join us in 2 weeks on 18 November for our next webinar, which is going to cover a Minerva Research Initiative project. And our guests will be Dr. Michael Allen and Dr. Carla Mashane. Thank you for your time today. Like us, follow us on social media. We have pages on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we certainly appreciate your comments and your thoughts there. And finally, thank you, Dave, and best regards to all, and stay well.